Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Navina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Mark Rankin, and if you're not familiar with Mark, Mark is a multiple-time Grammy Award-winning engineer. He's won awards for his work with Adele on her 21 record. He's also won awards for his work with Queens of the Stone Age on their Like Clockwork record, and he's also worked with a ton of other big artists, everyone from Weezer, Florence and the Machine, Foster the People, and a whole bunch more. And in today's episode, we dive deep into Mark's process when it comes to tracking instruments or mixing them. And he's very thorough with his answers, which makes it really easy to be able to take everything he talks about here and apply it to your own tracks. But we dive deep into his philosophies on tracking and how he likes to go about tracking drums with minimal miking, how he likes to capture a lot of ambience during the tracking stage. And he's got some really cool suggestions there as far as different mic techniques to use, different mic selection tips. There's lots of really cool things that he does during the tracking stage that make his mixes end up sounding really cool. And so he dives deep into his process on that. And then we dive into his mixing process. And again, he's very thorough there as well. And he walks us through what his sessions look like, how he organizes them, how he works, what order he works in, and how he introduces a lot of color and character to his tracks. And he's got a very specific process there, which I think is, again, part of why his mixes sound so cool, is that he does all of these little things in his sessions that all come together to give a cool character to his tracks. So yeah, I think you're going to really enjoy this episode because there is so much good stuff in here. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Mark Rankin, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you and your background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into all of this stuff, can you give us that story?
Yeah, I am from London originally. I live in LA now, but I'm from London originally. I started my career at the mastering studio. Wasn't my intention. I'd kind of did the standard, did some college, basically like a community college thing, because I was like, this is what I want to do for a job. So I went and did that just to get something on my resume. I did the thing where you send out your resume to all the studios in London, and one studio got back to me, and it was a mastering studio that I hadn't intended to send my CV to in the first place. So I was like, great, someone. So I went and just, started as a runner. I did that thing of getting the lunch and all the rest of it, and basically would hang around after the sessions, just to learn and just hang out with the engineers and get whatever experience I could. It was a great place to start because turns out I didn't think that at the time, but, seeing that process first was a great way to start. And obviously there would be people, producers and artists coming into the studio to master their stuff, so you get to meet lots of people. Eventually I wanted to go and work in a recording studio, so I had an offer or something at the time, but then the boss who owned the place was like, why don't we just build the studio here, because we had this other unit in the building that was just used for storage. So okay, that was something I couldn't really turn down. So yeah, I got to build a recording studio. It was one room, but it was full wet build, poured concrete floor. So we had to speak to acousticians to get the loading and everything and do that properly, and block walls and everything just to kind of do a proper job on it. So I built it, and then we fitted it out, and then I would go off, me and the guy who owned the studio would go off to auctions and stuff, and he was really into vintage gear, so we'd buy up all these ribbon mics and tube preamps and stuff, and we had we had a 24 track studio in there which we used as a 16 track 2-inch. We built a mixing console because you'd get so many, because he was like a gear nut, you would get so many people similarly come in, and there was this guy came in, I can't remember exactly who it was, but he'd got all of these great big pots, potentiometers from the BBC. So they was huge pots, they were this big with silver contacts. And we had all these parts. We were like, let's test these and build a console. But the console was literally a level control and a pan control, because everything had to be super minimal. So we got, I'm sure it exists somewhere, but he was a bit out there. So we went to this antique shop and we bought an antique walnut wardrobe and took a door off of it. And that was the top of the console.
Wow.
And so we drilled, 16 rows of 2 holes for a level pot and a pan pot. And so somewhere, I'm sure he still has it, probably, is this like walnut, 5 foot long walnut thing with chicken head knobs for level and pound for 16 channels.
That's
And like,
amazing.
we had to work everything out. So it was an incredible learning experience. I think part of the amazing thing there was obviously it was all one room. So we would have one of the first session we did because of the people who used to come to the mastering studio. It was around the time that I think it was the Neptunes did that song maybe with Justin Timberlake that had a drum kit that was like a banging drum kit that no one had really done that for a while. So all of a sudden everybody wanted live drums. So I think Basement Jaxx, I don't know if you've heard of those guys. They were like a electronic music band from the UK. They came in and they wanted to do some live drums. They were like, yeah, let's do it in here. So the first session I did was for Basement Jaxx, recording drums, which was great. But like learning like that, I had no previous experience. So I was just put in the room. And so, I would hear what the drum kit sounded like because I was in the same room. And so you'd kind of put mics on it. It sounded good in there. We would sort of have the band up one side of the room. It was like a shoebox length, not too high ceiling, band up one side and then control rooms down the other end. So you'd record a bit, go back, play it back, listen, make some adjustments, and that was it. So, learning like that, actually listening to the kit and an amp or whatever, I think was quite a cool way to start and learn because I wasn't listening to a mic signal that came out of the speakers. I was actually listening to the drums in the room and trying to recreate that.
That's very cool.
So, yeah, so it was an interesting way to kind of learn, I think. And you'd be like, why doesn't it sound like, I get this feeling when he's playing, I want it to sound like that. So yeah, it was a great education. So that kind of ran for a while and it did well. One of the artists who came in was Paul Epworth, the producer and songwriter. And he was in a band at the time called Lomax, and he was doing a cover of a song for an NME thing or something. So he came in and I met Paul and we did this thing. And then he started getting more work and got popular and kept coming back in. And then the sort of mastering downturn thing happened where Napster kicked in and budgets weren't quite what they were. So they had to close the studio. So unfortunately, yeah, we had to close the recording side of it. So I managed to wangle buying a lot of the equipment, and then I took it and set up in one of the Moloko studios in London. It's called The Pool. Currently, it's a great studio in London. But at the start, as that was just being born, a producer called Ben Hillier basically created the Pool. It used to be like a storage room. It was a big, great room, but they just had loads of storage stuff in it, which was, again, just one big room. So Ben was like, oh, I'm setting a studio up in this room. Why don't you bring your gear and set it up with me and we'll share it? And so I did that. So I got that opportunity, which was fantastic, So I moved in there with him, started working, and I bumped into Paul Epworth again. And he was like, oh, I need an engineer. I'm doing this album for Kate Nash. So I went and did this record with Paul, and then that was a success. And so we carried on, and I stayed working with Paul, and we had a great run. We did records like Florence and the Machine and Jack Pignate and Adele. And then, worked with him for a good long while before I did the inevitable sort of go and set out alone, Yeah, so that's the basics of how I got here.
That's amazing. I love that journey. And I think it has an interesting twist compared to like a lot of the stories that I hear on the podcast, which is that you started with mastering. And I think that that's maybe a cool area to dive a little bit deeper into because, with mastering, you're only focused on the big picture of a track. You can't get into the weeds. Whereas like a lot of people getting started with the engineering and mixing, like they get hyper focused on like the micro dynamics and like all the little details, right? And those people often have trouble seeing the big picture. So you're kind of coming at it from a different perspective. So when it came to switching from mastering to tracking and to mixing, how did you shift your mindset to be able to adapt to like focusing on the micro things instead of the macro?
Yeah, you're right. It's an interesting transition. I always thought, oh, that was like the wrong way to start. I wish I did the regular thing. I think Andrew Sheps once said, I told speaking to him about it once, he was like, no, that's the right way to do it. That's what they used to do at Abbey Road. They would start people in the mastering. So you see what the limitations are or whatever, or what's required at that point. Yeah, I was always like previously to going to college and that I had been like a hobbyist. I grew up with dance music. It was big when I was young, like the house music scene and everything. So originally I started out with the sampler and turntables and started producing that way. So I sort of that was my first bit of knowledge. And then at the exchange, I learned, like I said, I had this like birth of recording of just actually standing next to the instruments and learning that way. So I always sort of chased that feeling of electronic music and like how it hits. And then obviously being in the room with these instruments, I think I always kind of like looked for making big sounds. So yeah, it's kind of weird because I went from there to the pool, which was also in one room. So I just always wanted to create exciting sounds. It wasn't about, I don't know, being pure or whatever. It's just like something had to hit me, like I felt when I was in the room with instruments. So like the mastering thing was definitely great because you'd hear a lot of great mixes come in and speak to people and be like, how did you do it? Being like an assistant, you'd be sort of at the back and being like, dude, it sounds amazing. How did you do that? And they'd sort of tell you whatever, how they got this or what the rules they were applied at the time. So I just sort of would, collected all those bits of information as you do. And then I mostly learned on the job, it was like, because I was never really training as a mastering engineer. I was there helping and I got let loose on the lathe and everything and to try, and listen and give my opinion. But it was never ultimately what I wanted to do. I always wanted to record and mix. I once saw a thing in, I think, Sound on Sound, which is like a full spread of Spike Stent. I think after he did like Spice Girls or something like that. And I was just like, that's it. He was leaning over an SSL. This I sort of remember the picture now, and it was just like, and I'd met him once. I was like, Spike, I've got to say, like you were the reason I kind of like went after this. He was like, oh yeah, totally. It's like me and Bob Clearmountain. I totally geeked out when I saw him. It's like, yeah, same as me. It's great.
That's awesome.
But yeah, I just sort of was learning, working it out as I went. Made some mistakes, of course, because I didn't really know what I was doing. But it turns out that's not a bad thing. If you're going to push it and experiment with stuff, sometimes you got to do things wrong. I learned like Paul, who I started working with, he had actually trained as a engineer, like he worked at Air Studios or something. So he had a lot of that knowledge. So working with Paul, as well as a songwriter and producer, he's great at those things. He's also a great engineer. So I learned a lot of probably the more traditional stuff from Paul. I mean, he was experimental, but he'd been through that system of like the standard kind of studio path.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, it's actually very interesting because as you're describing this, it does make a lot of sense for why you would want to start learning mastering first. Because then, yeah, you are focused on the big picture. If you're in a mastering studio, you're hearing tons of new music every day from different producers who have different techniques. So there's a lot to learn about how to make something cohesive with a ton of different sounds and different techniques. And so that in itself is interesting, but also from a networking perspective, like you mentioned earlier too, like you're meeting a lot of these different producers. And if your goal is to eventually be a mastering engineer, you need to know all these producers. If your goal is to become a tracking engineer, it's still good to know all these other producers and engineers because you can work with them,
totally.
Right?
Yeah, that's it. It's like, for anybody who wants to do the job, it's finding a way to be around those people. It's like, I thought of this the other day. It's like the path to be, a path to being, working on some really cool stuff. It's like a saloon, like an old West saloon where you're all kind of waiting around the top. Like the producers come in and you're like, hi, You know, you work in a studio and you're kind of just meeting people. And at some point you meet someone and you're like, oh yeah, I love what you do. And you vibe with them or you get on with them. And then that you may get a call to, oh, we're going to do this project. Do you want to come and help out? You know, and that's the kind of typical path of how it happens. You know, it's like a way in. It's how it's
Yeah, that's very
just,
cool.
it's so much about meeting people and personalities and who you click with and who you complement, you know. So the more people you meet in whatever field you want to be in, the better, you know. Just nothing to it but to do it.
But it's also interesting too, because you talked about how when you did eventually move into, you know, tracking, and you were tracking all in the same room as the drummers and everything like that, you'd mentioned that like your vision for that was like, I wanted to sound like I'm in the room, which again is kind of like a big picture point of view. It's like you're not focusing on like the little dynamics of every microphone. It's like, I know that I wanted to sound like this big picture, big room sound. So you were shaping, you were adjusting your mics and stuff like that to get that sound. And that kind of, you know, I think one of the reasons why you probably felt like you needed to make those adjustments was because close mics just don't sound like a drum kit, you know, like you need to hear all that ambience. So, and that was one of the things that when I was doing some research on you, like I read about, I read that like you typically like to use ambience in very creative ways and mix, and you like to capture a lot of room sound. And now it makes sense because you're literally tracking in the same room and trying to recreate that sound. So I'm curious to know, like, can you share some creative ways that you capture room mics, or maybe that you've used them in mixes to create that ambience?
Yeah, it's funny. Like I said, working that way, you'd learn. One other thing I just thought of, sorry, is that I'd learn, like working at the Exchange. After a while of doing it like that, I knew what something was going to sound like if I used a certain mic and a certain pre in a certain position. Especially with ribbon mics, you move a ribbon mic 1 inch and it will change the sound. And you learn that, you know, for people out there who sometimes, yeah, just changing a combination of microphone and preamp will completely change the sound. Instead of just reaching for an EQ, we didn't have the option of reaching for EQs, really. We had some, but it was like a 19-inch rack mount EAR EQ that weighed a ton that I'd have to go and get from the storeroom, bring it in, put it on the desk, and plug it in after the preamp and before the tape machine and add EQ. First thing to try would be moving microphones, you know. So then it's interesting. You can get a lot out of combinations of microphone and pre, and depending on source. So yeah, and then just like you said, you put a microphone on a drum kit, you're hearing the head and you're not hearing the resonance, you're not hearing the air around it. So you kind of learn to move stuff out, and gradually you out and out. So yeah, as far as then going into doing room mics, in the Exchange wasn't a huge room. Like I said, it was like, I don't know, it was like 30 foot by 20 foot or something. So trying to get a big sound there was tricky. You couldn't always have doors open, so we had a little corridor outside, but sometimes you could have the door open and you would put a microphone facing out into the hall, which is a bright area, so the sound you'd learn, you know, the sound would travel and reflect nicely out there. So you'd stick a microphone out there. And then one thing I learned early on was facing mics, ambient mics, away from the source. You get a natural delay. So one of the times I did that to greatest effect was on a Queens of the Stone Age record on Like Clockwork, Keep Your Eyes Peeled, I think. First song on that record is pretty much about 4 microphones. It's like a pair of stereo ambient mics. The Pink Duck studio that was the Queen studio was, again, like a kind of long room. Drums would be down one end in the corner, sort of facing diagonally into the room. And I had a pair of stereo Violet, I think, condenser mics, almost at the back of the room, facing away from the drum. So basically facing at the back wall. And the way that room worked, the sound just like bounced off the back wall and it has a real punch to it. So that is essentially the drum tone on that record. I think there's definitely like a mono overhead, a kick mic, and probably a snare mic. But that's mostly just ambient mics on that song. So I would always, I still do now, if I'm recording drums, first thing I listen to when I put the mics up is the ambient mics and the overheads, because that's where the drum sound is. Everything else is reinforcement. I want to make that drum kit sound incredible in the room. So obviously the first thing you're doing is tuning the drums and getting them in a position where you've got low end in the room. And if you're not hearing it, why not, move some stuff around, or quite often walk around the room of the snare drum and find the spot where it sounds the biggest. So yeah, it's like getting it to sound big. If you can put up the overheads and the ambient mics and effectively have like a killer drum sound, yeah, everything else is downhill. You kind of get a kick mic if you want a bit more weight and punch on the kick, and the same with the snare, and then any detail things. So quite often it's just like those are the most important. Sometimes there'll be a couple of different sizes, like close in ambience or real far ones. Often I'm like trying to work it out of a pair, just because the more things involved, the more confusing it gets. So for like phase or whatever, or timing. Yeah, that's like number one, is getting it to sound huge in a room. And then quite often it's, once you get that, it's just like you're putting mics on the kind of close on the cymbals. So if you want to get that detail in there, you can just like bring those up a little bit and it's there.
That's very cool. Yeah, that ties into a question that I was going to ask you, is because I really love the sounds of the drums on that record that you did for Queens. The cool thing about that record is that the drums, like, they have that ambience. They're a little dark. They're a little gritty overall. And I think with that ambience, like, it forces the drums to maybe sit a little bit further back in the mix, but they also don't feel like they get lost in the mix either. There's still a balance of clarity versus the roominess of it all. And so, you described how you mic'd up, at least for that one song, like a 4-mic technique, which is pretty simple. I think a lot of people would feel like they have to overcomplicate and have all the close mics and all that kind of stuff. But it's cool that you were talking about having just like a minimal setup and focusing on that ambience. But as far as then blending, ambient mics with close mics and finding that balance of, making that ambience still be defined without having the close mics also sounding like they're too close or too present in a mix. Like, how do you go about balancing those together?
Like I said, if you can get that down on the ambient mics, ideally you don't need much else. Obviously you need some, but you need something to time the ambient mics again. So you'd have like a close mic on the kick, say, and then you bring that in and see how they're interacting. Then if the ambient mics are maybe too far, if it's too sluggish sounding or it slows things down, then you bring them in a bit, to try and tighten that up. Or you might kind of like, I might slowly rotate them so they're not totally pointing the wrong way.
So you're not getting like a slappy kind of delay.
So you don't,
sound
if the room is too big, it may be just, timing wise, obviously you want it to be timed within the song. So that pre-delay, if you like, is as in time as possible. So it may be like slightly, moving like I said, it's just moving microphones. You can like face them down, face the floor. You might have to turn them back and face the right way. It's just playing with that. So you'd need a couple of mics on the kit really to, work that timing out and make sure it feels like the right thing. And then you got to look at phase, obviously, and, don't be afraid to mess with phase and listen in mono and make sure it's punchy and you're not losing anything. And these days you can look at the waveform on the computer, and see how it's looking. And not always about that, but it helps. Most important thing is to listen, But yeah, anyone out there learning, I'd say first thing you should learn mic and drum kit almost is like the Glyn Johns thing, where you have 3 mics on a kit, because it does so much. Instead of putting them right on the drums, do the Glyn Johns thing, which is like you'd measure, and if I'm sure people, I'm not going to be technically accurate with this because it's been a while, but you have 1 mic over the snare at a distance. Actually, the first one my version of that would be, I would put one just by the side of the floor tom, on the outside of the floor tom, looking toward the snare drum, and I'd measure that and get that distance. Then you'd measure up from the snare drum and put an overhead, same microphone if possible. Those are the 2 important ones to be the same. If you had a stereo pair, you put one by the floor tom, and then you measure up the same distance above the snare, put one there, and then you put one, in theory, the same distance from the snare in front of the kick drum. Quite often I would just put one by the hole and see how it worked out and then move that around, because you want that I would always look for that punch. But if you do that and you pan the snare one to the right, or whichever way you're looking at it, and the floor tom on the other way, you instantly get a stereo image of the kit with air around it. It's incredible when you get it right. It's the fact that he came up with that is in genius. But for someone who doesn't have a lot of resources, it's an incredible way to make a good sounding recording. And you get the sound of drums in a room. That's the trick with drums, is having it sound like a drum kit and not just a load of individual, percussive elements.
So then when you mic up a drum kit these days, like, do you still like to stick to that minimal kind of setup, or do you sometimes go a little bit more detailed and have all the close spot mics on everything?
I definitely go more detailed and usually have full spot mics, because if I'm seeing the job from start to finish, then it's my choice. I will sometimes stick to just a few mics if that's the thing you're going for. Try and achieve it and nail it, and have a few mics and that's it. Don't need to overcomplicate it. You don't always need a hi-hat mic or whatever, as long as it's coming through, as long as you're getting enough of everything. If I'm doing a job for someone else, quite often I'll just have options. So I'll have the main sound, which is like, this is what I would do, and I would have ambience doing the thing, and probably overheads with a bit of distance or a mono overhead. Sometimes, like I said, there'll be a one in between, like a front of kit or behind the kit or something, usually that's like that's treated, so it has a bit of a vibe, like the kind of compressed malt mic, that you would maybe sometimes do a malt and really slam something. So there'll be one of those. And then usually, I'll have, I'll like spot mic the kit. So you have that, but you can also get in. So basically, if someone not too sure what they want, I'll do all of that and then be like, okay, look, we've got options. We've got these like slamming ambient mics, and then you've got this kind of treated through some outboard gear, close-ish kind of ambient mic. And then you've got all the fill-in mics, like the kick mic and quite often I just use one kick mic. I don't always use two. Sometimes, one inside and one outside, but usually I'll start with one just inside the hole, looking at the beater, and that does a great job. And then often I'll have one like 2 foot out at the front with some compression on it or something, or it really depends. But quite often I'll just do a lot of stuff as options, and so you can do this or you can do this, and you can kind of close it down or you can open it up. This is the basic.
That's cool. I like that. Well, I also like that you distinguish too that if you're working for someone, you might give them all of those options. But if it's something that you're seeing all the way through, like, you'll usually just commit, even if it's a minimal setup, because the sound you're going for. So I think that's an important thing, because a lot of people listening to this, they are working on their own stuff at home, but they feel like they need to overcomplicate things because they're like, what if, or like they're searching for options. They don't necessarily have a defined sound early on, and so I mean, there's pros and cons to having the options, I suppose, but when you know the sound you want, you can just commit to it right away and go
just
for it.
Try and commit to it. Yeah. And like I said, the starting point of that is, especially with drums, is in the kit, tuning it and having it sound good in the room. One interesting thing is on the Adele 21 record that I did with Paul, I think the song, it was a writing session. So Paul had this kind of small studio that was like, it was probably like 15 feet wide and only like 5 foot deep. It was a real kind of shed of a room. It was just like his little writing room early on. And we had the drums in one corner and microphone and up the other end, just as the ambient mic, and a couple of mics on the kit. But on the writing sessions of those songs, that drum sound totally fitted what was needed. I think they went off and had the idea of doing the whole record with Rick Rubin, Shangri-La. And so I think she went and did that, and most of it was great. And then I think she was missing a couple of just the feel of some of those, the rawness of some of those recordings. So some of those sounds, she came back and we redid them. Some of those sounds stayed on the finished record. It's like, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be a $5,000 a day studio or whatever, or $3,000 a day studio. It's just, if it's right, it could be the sound in your room at home. It's like, the room itself has its magic. And I quite often like rooms that are not acoustically proper rooms because you get a bit of feedback in there. You get some resonance and it's a bit odd. Like most of the studios I started off at, we built and just kind of did it by ear. So they weren't, we sort of had advice, but they weren't technically perfect. But I learned if you put the drums or the upright bass in the corner, you use that resonance because the room would resonate a bit and you get a bigger sound and you can use that. So yeah, don't be afraid to, don't think instantly that whatever you're doing at home isn't good enough because quite often it's just what's needed.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah. One of the habits that I've got into more recently with my productions that I'm engineering is that if I'm often in a cool space, like at the end of the session, I'll just start recording impulse responses of the room sometimes just because I want to keep those later. And I find that one of the most commonly used ones that I have is a bathroom of this house that I recorded in once. It sounded awesome. So now I use it on so much stuff because it has such a cool character to it.
Yeah, and it's different and it's unique. It's like
it's not the same like lexicon reverb or something like that everyone else is using.
Exactly. Yeah, anything like that it's great. It's incredible to get something unique. It's like that's really what you're after. It's something interesting and wrong, but right.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, you don't need to fit a drum set in a small bathroom. You could just use the stuff in post sometimes and get it right.
yeah. Although sometimes it's fun to try that. But
yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of ambience, another thing that I heard that you like to do is that sometimes you'll treat your background vocals a little bit differently than you would with your lead vocals in the tracking stage. I've read that sometimes you'll play around with miking techniques, that kind of stuff. Can you maybe go into some detail in terms of like what that typically would look like for you and kind of what the thought process is behind treating those two things differently?
Yeah, I learned a really valuable lesson once. Earlier, like I said, I started off, I didn't really know what I was doing. I had basic training, I had some ideas, but I didn't really know what was right or wrong. But I did a song once for Travis, the band from Scotland called Travis. I was doing a session with those guys, and they were obviously way more experienced than I was at the time. So we recorded some vocals. And then we got to doing BVs. So long ago, but I think it's Dougie, in the band. Walked up to the mic. We just had one mic up, and this is the mic, and he's kind of facing this way because there was some mics, and I thought, oh, he's singing into the wrong mic because there was a mic over there, and I was like, Dougie, we're on that one. He was like, yeah, I know. But then obviously he was just like singing into the room, like not directly into the mic, just so you instantly get that. It's instantly a different space. You don't have to put any effect on it or anything. So I was like mind blown. It's like, oh my God, you do that? You don't want to back up one. Do you want to sing into that and we'll put another one up? But no, it's just no, this is it. We're just going to sing that and that's it. I'm going to nail it. And that's what happened. And it's amazing. It's like, okay, you can do that sort of stuff. Right. I get it. So, I suppose you get that with experience, but that's such a great idea. Just sing the other direction. Like as long as it's, same thing as ambient mics with drums. Just do it and listen. Like turning sideways is incredible because you instantly get an slightly more ambient sound, but you put up at the same level as the lead vocal, which is sung direct, and it's set back. It's actually a background vocal. So that's a great one. You don't need any different equipment. Just move off the mic and sing in the background. So that like carrying that on, if you've got a million mics, set up a different mic. Like say you're using a condenser mic on the lead and you've got that chain, maybe have a dynamic mic for a background vocal or a ribbon mic or something that's just not as present, as maybe has a different tone. So instantly it's a different space, so you've got separation between these two things. You record everything on the same mic, it's going to have a similar character, so you're going to have to move it in the mix or try and set it back. So yeah, things like that. Just don't be afraid to experiment and maybe sing through an effects unit. Maybe just that's another way, just to give something different. The less you have to do in a mix, the better. It's like some of those old tricks of when people were more limited and didn't have 64 tracks on Pro Tools, or it's obviously more now, but there would be like 8 tracks, so they would have to be really creative about what they put on those tracks. And so I love doing that now. Like still like treat Pro Tools like a tape machine. Obviously you can do more stuff with it. But the more things you can commit to at source and be happy with, like think, yeah, we've got it. It's great. Like again, going back to that Adele record, you listen to the BVs on Rolling in the Deep, and it's through my chorus echo, like a rolling chorus echo. It's just the BVs it sounds like someone else, but it's Adele, slightly tweaking her voice, singing straight into the spring on a Roland chorus echo. And we printed it, that's it. It's like, and that's with Adele, you're like, could we be on like a, M50 or whatever, or for her? No, we'll record it through a chorus echo, Paul wanted to do something different, and no, it works.
It worked, yeah. I mean, it clearly is a hit song, so something worked right there,
Yeah, yeah. And it's great. I remember seeing that song. It's a great lesson. Even I was involved in it, but it's a great lesson. Like you see it, it's basically all on one page. There's not a lot of doubles or options. The idea actually was to not double anything, to make it not sound like a particular era. So it's all on one page, and you see the progression as it goes, and it's whatever the stomps are there, and the guitar starts it, and it's not doubled with a million things. It's super simple. It's genius, writing and production. But it's just a lesson in commitment, just like commit and get it to see if you can get it right first time and just nail it.
Of course. Yeah. That's very cool. Well, I mean, kind of in relation to everything we've just been talking about here, like with drums, you said that you like to focus on getting the drums to sound like they're in the room. Do you treat like guitars or vocals in the same way? Like, will you often have like an ambient mic for like a lead vocal, maybe kind of somewhere in the room as well?
Pretty much always. Yeah. Always do that. Like you said, sometimes you find a space, it's unique. So if you've got a microphone in the room, it's going to be, that's a unique sound. So try and keep that and maybe make something weird out of it, Yeah, lots of tricks like that are so much fun to do and give you a great result. Something that just people might be like, what is that? Like guitars, we did that on Queens of Stone Age again. We did that on, I think, the Villains record. Weirdly enough, it's a lot of DI guitars on that record, because Josh's idea was to have everything kind of like lots of stuff kind of pasted up in your face. So a lot of those guitar sounds are DI'd through pedal boards and processed. But then what we would do is send that out to a room through an amp with a delay on it or something, and then have an ambient mic in the room. So you get the initial signal, like the guitar line, that's the sound, but then panned to the left is this electrified ambient version of that. And it gives you so much space in a mix, without a ton of outboard gear. It's kind of like you put those two faders up and you've instantly got this interesting sound, that has depth and dimension to it. And I kind of I like to get lost in that stuff, like when you can like put a record on and you hear, it's like envelops you a bit and you hear the space. Yeah, I love doing that sort of stuff. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, definitely. I usually have, if I have something in a room, usually I'll have an ambient mic for recording vocals. So, and then, it's like I'd record it, and then if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But you try and get it to work, and sometimes that's really cool. Maybe it's even the main sound, someone a bit further away, it just conjures up a bit of emotion or something, it's like I said, it builds the picture.
Of course. I love that. Yeah. It sounds like you're not necessarily like hoping for happy accidents here. Like you're still listening to the sound of the room. So you kind of already have an idea of like, this is how it should sound with this effect in, or this room mic or whatever. So it's not just like experimenting for the sake of experimenting.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, if you kind of feel like this could be good, you're always thinking that, when you get that, when you're working there and exploring the room, so you're in a new place. And sometimes it's just like opening up a mic. Maybe there's a mic, maybe like super compressed mic you put on the drum kit is still there. So if you've got someone in the room singing and they're singing loud, you'll be like, I wonder what that sounds like, and just crank that up, and maybe that's doing something really cool. Maybe there's like resonating one of the drums and it sounds odd, like the snare mic, the undersnare.
It's like that Phil Collins SSL talkback mic
Yeah,
technique,
exactly. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like that was an
exactly.
accident there. Yeah.
Look what happened to that. Yeah,
It became a
exactly. You never
sound.
know.
Yeah. I love that. That's awesome. Well, I mean, we've talked a lot about your tracking process and your approach to kind of planning for a mix. I'd love to shift over to talking about mixing. And I'm curious to know, like, when you start a mix, what's your typical approach there in terms of like how you get started with a mix, or if it's something that you've never worked on before, like what's your mindset going into something like that?
I guess first thing I'm doing is making sure. I think ideally the starting point of a mix is you start wherever the producer or the artist left off. So if you get the session, you basically just make sure that what they've been listening to is where you can start off from, and then you're off to the races. You can then get into it and do whatever you feel like needs correcting or adjusting. But yeah, essentially, someone has worked hard on something to get it to a point. I've learned over the years that's the right thing. So it means you got to buy a lot of plugins. Well, thankfully these days
So are
you can
you
render.
you're actually taking someone's mix and working from that session. You're not necessarily like trying to recreate it in your own session or changing their session setup to adapt to yours, that kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, like it's sort of small steps. Usually I'll get the session and make sure it's playing back or it's close to where they left off. After that, you're sort of adjusting it so you're comfortable with it. Part of the thing of mixing is not having to think too much about administrative stuff. Like sessions, I have a certain color coding for sessions, which is important because I think everyone does. But so it means that like if you're looking for something, you know roughly where to look. But everybody has their own colors. So for mine, keys are always yellow. So if I'm listening for a sound and like, oh, it's a key sound, you go to the yellow, you just instantly you're in the right spot. So that is important, like management of the session and the routing. Mine is it's probably fairly straightforward compared to others. I start off with drums down one end, they're all blue, they go to a bus. If it's a drum kit, the bus is usually doing something. I'll have a drum mult as well, which is compressed, and you sort of blend that into taste. Usually it's all going through a drum bus. If it's more like a pop thing or electronic thing, there's less processing on the bus because, keeping the weight of kicks and snares, I'm sort of processing those sounds individually more and just using the bus as a kind of overall bit of control for drums level or muting or whatever. So sessions will go like that. All drums going through a bus, percussion through their bus, bass, and so on. If it's a live stuff, it's usually a bass DI and an amp or something, and you play around and see which one is kind of delivering what you want, and make sure you're kind of feeling what you're looking for. So it's a bit of, you do a bit of reorganizing and make sure your outputs, and I bring in a bunch of effects ends. So I basically bring in all of my buses, drums, bass, and all that stuff. Bring in effects. Usually the effects I bring in are usually for vocals. Instrument effects, that will change every song. So I'll do that as I go and I make up effects. I don't usually share effects between instruments or vocals. Everything has its own effect. So you can treat something like a group, and I can later on when I come to print stems, it's not confusing. You can have everything with its dedicated effect.
That makes sense to me because I often hear a lot of people say like you should send multiple instruments to the same reverb or whatever because then it creates a cohesion between all of them. But I agree, like and maybe you are using the same effects on different tracks, but if you have them all separate, then it makes it super easy for your stems.
Yeah, and it can be exactly the same setting, but I will still separate it. So when it comes down to later on printing stuff, Or even if you like half, three quarters of the way through a mix, you're like, I wonder what will happen if we distort that reverb for the vocal, for the lead or whatever. So if it's separate, then you can do that, and it doesn't. You don't have to then be like, oh, now I've just got to change everything, and so I just do that as I go. So you've got control and separation over everything, Unless you're going for this vintage thing where you're dedicated to just having one plate reverb, and then that's that. It is what it is. But yeah, so then that's pretty much it. And then or I then have a couple of buses, like I have a music bus and a vocals bus. So, going through the tracks, the lead vocal will be treated separately, and I'll have a lead vocal bus, aux, when I say buses, I just mean aux tracks. That will have its own effects, but then that will go to a vocal master, and then the BVs will have their own tracks and effects, but then they will all go to the same vocal master. So at the end of the session, I've got music bus and a vocal bus, and then a mix bus, like a master. So if I'm working on something, I can just mute all the vocals without having a ton of groups, I don't really like having a ton of groups on, like all the vocals grouped together, because sometimes I'm just working fast and you want to move something and you don't want it to affect everything else. So I just have everything separated out, and these like basically three master buses at the end, music bus, vocal bus, and they both go into the final mix bus, which is great for when you have to then print instrumentals and acapellas and stuff like that. But yeah, that's the basic setup, and it's like I said, I think it's pretty straightforward. I have stuff to taste. I usually have a good bunch of color on the final mix bus, often like tape emulation and interesting compressors and stuff, but they're not always doing anything. Sometimes some of those things, I mean, they sound great these days, plugins, there's so much color and interesting stuff. I haven't counted them, it's probably a million plugins out there, and some of them are great. You can just put the thing on and it does something without touching it. So I do that often with like things like the Shadow Hills limiter. I'll have that on the master bus, and it's never really doing anything, but the color of it, I think, is great. You kick it in and out and try the different settings on it, and it just does something.
Yep, I agree with that. I the same thing with the Shadow Hills. Like I think I lives on every one of my mixes, and it's just the transformers. I'm not even ever compressing on it. It's just you play with this transformer settings, and it does something cool. Yeah, all of a sudden you can have like more low end with your mix with the steel transformer versus the iron, whatever. It's super cool.
And it's just subtle, but it does a lot. In the chain, it's subtle, but it adds stuff, and you hear it, and you hear the vocals pop if you're. I can't remember what they are, but if you're in the top setting. The kind of more mid-rangey push is great. Yeah, there's usually a lot of stuff. Like I said, tape emulations, and like sometimes it's like the Abbey Road vinyl will be on there. Like some of those settings are cool, man. There's like add warmth and give you tone. It's great. Not always, and sometimes they're doing a lot, but usually, there's a lot of stuff that's just being passed through.
That's cool. So then do you take more of like a top-down approach where you'll start off with that master bus and get that character and that color and then work your way down to like the instrument buses and then the individual tracks, or do you kind of work the opposite way?
Yeah, no, I usually start off with, it's like a 50-50. Like I have a usual strip of things. Maybe there's like 6 or 7 plugins on the master bus. But then I will have some of them in bypass. Some of the things that I'm going to crank up a bit later, I'll have them in bypass. Like I really like the Ampex tape plugin, the UAD one. But so they'll be on there. That's usually on. But then some of the compressors will be off. And so I like to mix into something. I have the tape plugin on there, like an SSL, like the Cytomic, is it the glue? I like that version of the SSL. That's a great plugin. Usually it'll be that, an EQ. Usually it's a Poltec, the tape plugin. And then later on there'll be some other things. But so very least I'm mixing into those. And something that's, you crank up the output of the SSL compressor so you're at a decent level. And then later on, you can turn it down. That's sort of something that's a hangover from the analog world. Crank up the output of your master bus compressor So you didn't have to pull all the faders down. If if you start pushing into it, things get louder, you can just turn the output that down. So I still do that. So I like to kind of have that as a starting point. So there's a bit of color, a bit of compression, but I've gradually, as I've learned more, I'm doing less on that master bus compressor. It's like barely moving. So, but I'm mixing into it, but it's not doing that much, and there's some color on there. So then I'll go back and start treating other instruments, like whatever is the driving force in the song. So quite often it's the drums. You'll get the drums going because there's something I'm looking for. So I will start. So basically, I'll try and dial in the sound that I want at source. So there'll be a drum bus compressor, but also that's not doing too much. So there'll be something on there. Usually it's an API, the 2500, I think, something like that. Again, a bit of Portec or a bit of EQ, sometimes a Abbey Road or Chandler thing, and not that much. So I'll start with one drum bus with those couple of things on. Then I go back to the instruments and then I start working on the instruments. So the buses are kind of doing something, but I don't want to rely completely on them. I'd like to get, if the drums are slamming, and I don't want that to be at the detriment of something else later on. So I'll kind of try and do that within the drums and to a degree the drum bus. So it's kind of like goes in stages. I'll start dialing the drums in and get them, compressing things or treating things to get that energy going. And then I'll find it sort of cascades down. So once I get that and it's kind of happening, I'll bring everything else in and do the same process with the bass, guitars, and get the engine of it going. And then I'll sort of work back again. And then I bring in a drum mult bus, so you take a multiple of the bus. So for anyone who doesn't know that, and on Pro Tools, I do it. So I just copy the bus and I make sure it has exactly the same plugins on. Even if I'm not using them, I have them on there for timing, so there's no phase weirdness. They can be in bypass, but it'll give you the same signal so it doesn't start being weird. That's important. But so then I'll just mute the original bus and then start dialing the drum mult bus in to do something cool. So slam it, push it, crank the EQ up if it's a Politech, turn the EQ up and really hit that compressor and get the energy going, get it to a point where it sounds exciting, and then again, mute it, turn the fader down, unmute the original bus, and then slowly bring that mult bus up until you don't often need that much of it. And then you bring that in and then you start getting this energy really cooking, and then you sort of adjust and see where that fits with the song. And so it's a process, and then if the track is like, I feel like it's exciting and everything's kind of probably in at this point, then I'll start switching other things on the master bus. Like I said, it's not usually, I don't usually have the master bus being slammed unless it's a particular effect that you're going for a song. There's a lot of things doing a little, each one's doing a little. So it's never going to be like you're never going to put a final limiter on and then put it at -6, but I may put one on and just hit it a little bit. So it's like a lot of individual processes adding up.
Yeah, it sounds like a very accumulative kind of thing that you've got going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. I like that approach, and I think it makes a lot of sense too. Just go small. Don't rely too heavily on like one plugin to do all the heavy lifting. It can all just add up throughout the session, and you get individual control.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and if you're, distortion is important. I think I love distortion and using it. But if everything is distorted, then it just all sounds distorted. But if you've got one thing that's distorted and it's texture, and it gives you a bit of dimension, so you can control that and have it as a definite thing,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, with like the mults on the drums, like you could do that. So like you could have your mults distorted if you wanted, and then you blend in that distortion just on the drums, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
exactly. Yeah, cool. Quite often I'll do that with vocals. I'll have a mult on the vocal which is slammed and driven, and it's another thing where you can just slightly bring that in, and it will just like give the vocals an edge. and a kind of like a consistency so you can hear it at low levels. Yeah.
I love doing that, and every time I have an artist in the studio with me, I'll bring up that distorted vocal, and they're like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! What are you doing?" But then you just blend it into taste, and it's always like, "Wow, this works great."
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. It doesn't need to be slamming, but it helps. It's great.
Yeah, you're not necessarily going for that like full blown The Strokes kind of sound where it's it's meant to be super in your face, right? But yeah. No, it's cool. Like all of these little things that you're talking about here, they're just adding little color and texture to the sound overall, and you're just blending it to taste and giving it little bits to make it a little less sterile, I guess, and just give every instrument their own little character, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and you can maintain dynamics, so you're not flattening everything out, but you still got punch in drums and bass, and they're kind of doing this nice. You can, if you're not slamming everything at the end, you can get them doing this nice dance and keep the energy going. And just for me, the final bus is just kind of like keeping a little tiny, like holding somebody's head while they're swinging at you. Just keeping it a little bit under control.
I love that. Yeah. Well, one thing of your mixes that I really enjoy is like the way you handle your vocals. And like, I think you do a great job of getting your vocals to feel like in your face, get them to still sit well with the mix, have that clarity and all that stuff, but without also, it seems like you don't really rely on a ton of top end like a lot of modern mixes have. You can get these really brittle, harsh vocals, but your vocals seem to still have all that clarity without having to like rely too heavily on that kind of stuff. So I'm curious to know, like when it comes to mixing vocals, what's your typical kind of go-to strategy for tracking those or for mixing those?
I think at some point I was doing stuff, you gradually you change, you evolve and you learn. And like I said, I didn't know a lot when I started. So I've learned, I think I used to be quite bright at doing things, and I've gradually learned where to use that and where not to use that. So my vocal chain it's probably fairly typical. Like I will use, like a Neve 1073 or something, and that's usually on there. But then I will add more things like either tape or quite often after those things, you have like a bit of de-essing. So the basically the Neve is doing the kind of low end roll off if you don't need that, just cutting off any potential rumble and maybe a little lift in the, 3K or something, whatever that usual thing is, and then some compression on the 1176, which those you can push a bit, but usually that's only like -5 or something max, so that's like the first stage. And then I'll have something maybe with a bit more color. Like there's a plugin by Joey Sturgis, don't know if you know that. He has one compressor called gain reduction, which I love. It's like you can hear the electricity in it, it's just like breathes and it does this, it just kind of pins the vocals. So I'll have that, the initial process, and then quite often I'll have that on there. That's adding a bit of harmonic, and it's also doing that kind of nice Fairchild-esque thing where it's just kind of like letting the vocal breathe a bit but keeping it pulled slightly out of the speakers. And then after that it's usually whatever the song dictates as far as space or ambient goes. If there's nothing on there, you see what's originally on there. And like I said, usually people have worked on that stuff, so they'll have it dialed into what they like. But if that's not working, or you feel like maybe the verb's a bit long, or then I'll kind of go in and put some effects on there that suit the song. It's all about timing of delays, or I'm like looking basically to, unless it's a character effect, I'm looking to lift the vocal off the track. So quite often there's a bit of a slap or something, fairly tight slap going on, and a bit of ambience, like a close, short reverb. If it's a song where it's just the vocal is like a huge feature, like a vocal and acoustic or something, and then you're playing more with the space, and you'll have like longer verbs and the vocal is taking up much more space. So that's the starting point usually. If it's a song in a band, a song in a kind of musically dense song, vocal in a musically dense song, it'll be something to lift it off the music and just enough, while also making sure that it sounds like it's in the same world as everything else. There's usually a bit of width going on, a bit of fake width, which is be on a send. For that, I usually use I think it's the Waves doubler or something, where you'll basically have a pitch down on one side, slight pitch up on the other side, and maybe a slight delay on both. Like, you're talking like -6 cents on the one side, or you can go more. Sometimes it's 12. You can just play around with it. You can sort of pitch it down a bit on the left and up a bit on the right and add a delay to those two, like a 20 millisecond or something, and slightly bring that up into the vocal, and that'll further lift the vocal off track, So that's just like added to taste a little bit. And then you can play around with usually that won't go on everything, but then sometimes widening the effects and not the lead vocal will do a similar thing. So it's just about playing around within the song and finding what works, But that's like a sort of thing that I have set up as a standard thing, like a lead vocal wide, and it's just like a added to taste. It's hitting like, -20 or something like that.
That's very cool. Well, again, it's like adding color to an individual track and finding tools to use that or to introduce that stuff. That's very, very cool. Like you seem to have like these really subtle ways of infusing character to your sounds, which is really cool. I like that a lot.
Right. Yeah. I think, a little goes a long way. Sometimes it adds up. And I like to drive things and also like if someone gets loud singing and you hear them overload a bit of equipment, that's kind of cool because it got loud. It's like, let's print that. It's like, I think things like that will, like some old records that you would heard. There's so many like mistakes on those, but it's just gold. It doesn't need to be technically perfect. That's so boring. It's beige. Like if something was like overloads the desk on the way in, that's like, man, that was cool. The message is clear there. They got loud.
Yeah. I like that. That's awesome. So at the end of the day, with all of this stuff, like there's so many small details that you could focus on. How do you ultimately know when you're done with a mix? Like, do you have a point in your process where it's like, once you've reached that, you're done, or are you looking for something different?
So I'm constantly A/Bing with the reference mix to make sure that I'm beating it as far as I see, So once the vocals are in, the vocals are usually in quite early on, but I'll often take them out. If I'm working on instruments, I'll kind of make sure the engine is going. I'll bring the vocals in because you want the vocals to have their space. So there's no point mixing the whole instrumental track and being like, now there's no space for the vocal. So you've got to keep the vocals popping in and out. And so they'll have like a basic treatment to start. But essentially, I'm getting the song and the vibe going. So, you're going through that process and then BVs and everything. And once everything is in and it feels like it's doing what I want it to do, I'll usually print it and then I'll go listen out of the studio. And sometimes I'll do a car listen but the stereo in my car is so picky. It sounds awful unless it sounds good. So I'll definitely use that as a test. And I'm more and more going between headphones and speakers. So I have AirPod Pros that I love the sound of. I think they're great. I use those a lot to reference when I'm mixing, and there's a way I can listen as I'm doing it. Sometimes I'll tweak something on the AirPods, I'm always going back to the speakers, but I'll do a couple of listens outside. Like sometimes I'll put on AirPods and go for a walk or go ride my bike around. You go out the studio, get on your bike, ride, and then on the way back, play the song. So I wait, have a bit of air, then listen to it on the way back. And then it's great because you're not looking at anything, you're just listening, and you're not trying not to crash into anything on your bike. So you're, your mind is elsewhere. So that's where you hear things that you're like, okay, that's not quite right. And it's a technical thing, everything has to be in its place. But it's mostly a feeling that I'm looking for when I'm listening back. Am I being satisfied by what it's doing? Is it satisfying that thing of what I'm originally searching for? So once it gets to that point, it's kind of close to, once I'm happy with that, then I'll usually send it off, and be like, yeah, I've done, without knowing exactly what someone's going to think, I'm happy with everything it's doing. I can hear the lyrics, the choruses are lifting where they should be lifting, and it's exciting in the right place, So you're going to get all those dynamics in there, and maybe, you've dialed all this stuff in as much as you can. Quite often I like boost choruses into the master bus, the final mix bus, just like a bit, and you play around with that and you push the whole mix into it a little bit more in the chorus, just so everything really starts hitting the ceiling. It's like that thing I said about singers making the biting into it a bit. So yeah, once it's satisfying and I'm hearing it doing what it should, at that point I'll send it off. And so it's a lot of listening, and just I've got oratones or ref tones that I use, so I go between those and the big speakers. Yeah, just so I have a thing where basically I have 3 listening things in my studio. I have the bigger speakers. I have like ATCs, 50s. I have ref tones, which are little orotone speakers, and I have this little radio, like a little old radio, but it has an aux in, and it sounds good. It's got like a port on the bottom of it, so it has quite a good low end. So I have a thing where I go between those 3 sources, and like if tonally it's correct, it will keep its image on the 3 sources. Like I shouldn't switch the oratones and it goes weak or anything, There's like a certain point where you get where the image stays the same. It just gets bigger as I put it on the ATCs. Then you switch back and it just sort of gets a bit smaller again. It's when it sounds the same on all the 3 systems, I know it's doing the right thing.
Makes sense. Yeah. I like how you put that, though, of like going from small to big, because on your oratones, you're not going to have all of that low end that you would hear on your ATCs, but it still feels like the same song. It's not.
But tonally, the guitars aren't sort of suddenly going he or ho. Tonally, it sounds the same. It just gets bigger or smaller. That's a really good trick. When it sounds the same in all the speakers, then there's no weirdness going on. And you're kind of in a good spot.
I love that. Well, I think that's a perfect spot to start to wrap up. If people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I have like a website, which is, just a thing so people can find me. But I have a Instagram page, which usually I just sort of post. I've been neglecting it a bit, I'll be honest. But usually I just post stuff up just so keep people up to date on what I'm doing, But yeah, it's kind of it.
Awesome. Well, Mark, thank you so much again for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. And I love how thorough you were with like describing your process. I think that's really important and very helpful for a lot of people who are listening to this who might still be trying to figure out what that workflow looks like. And I think that the tips that you gave here just really make it easy to understand why you work a certain way and like give people a lot of cool things to experiment with in their own mixes. So thank you again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So that was my interview with Mark Rankin, and I really enjoyed getting a deep dive into his process with everything from his tracking stage to his mixing stage, and I do love the amount of detail that he went into there. I thought it was really cool to hear him talk about how he likes to really be methodical about ambient mics while tracking, and I thought it was interesting to hear him talk about just going very, very minimal when it comes to drum miking and focusing on a 4-mic technique, or like he talked about the Glyn Johns approach where you have 3 mics. It just really kind of brings into perspective how minimal you can go with tracking, but still get an amazing sound, and how you don't have to go crazy spot miking everything and overcomplicating the process. Like, he won a Grammy Award for a record that he did 4 mics on a drum kit. Like that's pretty awesome. And again, just goes to show you how minimal things can be if you get the sound that you hear in your head to come out of your speakers. And I think a lot of that has to definitely do with his experiences early on of tracking in the same room that he was monitoring things and trying to replicate that live sound. So I think that what he talked about in that respect is also really handy too, where like you need to experiment. You need to learn the different combinations of microphones and preamps and distance and angles and all this stuff, tunings and all that kind of stuff that really go into making something sound a certain way, and how all of these little details can largely influence and impact the sound. And I think that obviously it worked in Mark's favor, where he spent that time to experiment with those things and learn them so that when he has something in mind, he can execute on that and he can make it sound like it's a drum kit in a room or a guitar in the room or a vocal in the room, whatever it is, right? So, I think that's a really cool lesson in itself, is just take the time to experiment, learn your gear, learn different combinations. It's something that a lot of us tend not to focus on. We just want to work on our songs and that's it. But if you're not sure why you can't get the sounds that you want, it's likely because you haven't been experimenting with a lot of these things that Mark talked about here. So definitely take everything he talked about here and implement that into your own process. I think you're going to see much better results as a result of that. Now, I also really liked learning about his mixing side of things too, and I thought it was cool to hear him talk about how he likes to bring in a lot of subtle amounts of coloring and using plugins just for their character, not necessarily to compress or EQ a sound, but just to have the sound of a plugin in there. And, a great example of that is the Shadow Hills mastering compressor that he talked about there. That's something that I definitely use on all of my mixes because it has such a cool character to it. And the transformer knobs on that are really cool. So that's just one example of a plugin that can do something really cool. But then he also talked about the different tape simulations or distortion tools, that kind of stuff. Those can all do something really neat. So again, it's taking the time to learn your tools so that you can bring that into your sessions and ultimately shape your sounds and get a cool character or vibe from it. But you have to know those tools first, right? So spend the time to learn your equipment, and that's going to go a really long way as far as like helping you get the sounds that you ultimately want. So yeah, I thought that was really, really helpful to learn all of that stuff from Mark and get that insight into his process. And, clearly it's working. His mixes sound awesome. And like I said, he's won Grammy Awards using simple setups and it works. So you don't have to complicate the process. You just have to know your gear really, really well. So yeah, I really enjoyed chatting with Mark today, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode as well. Now, if you're listening to this episode and you're thinking, man, this sounds like a lot of work. Like, I don't really have the time or the patience to spend trying to understand these different tools and what they all sound like and do that trial and error kind of process. Instead, I want someone that can just help me learn this stuff quickly and ultimately help me execute on my vision for my songs. If that sounds like you, if you're looking for one-on-one help when it comes to your tracks, that is exactly what I work on with my coaching students inside of my program, Amplitude. I work one-on-one with my students. We establish what it is that you want your tracks to sound like. And then from there, we come up with a game plan from recording, editing, and mixing your tracks to help make sure that that vision comes to life. We're going to talk about everything from mic positioning, mic selection, instrument setup. We're going to talk about editing techniques and mixing techniques and building your templates and all sorts of stuff there that can help you speed up the process, feel way more confident in it, and again, get your vision to come to life. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And then I'd love to hop on a call with you. On that page, there's a link where you can apply for the program and hop on a call with me. And I'd love to chat more about your process. What are your goals? What's working for you? What's not working for you? To see how I can ultimately help. And if I can help you, then I'd love to invite you into the program. If I can't, I'll tell you that, and I won't want to work with you. I only work with people inside of this program who I truly believe I can help. So if you are looking for one-on-one help with your tracks, once again, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can get all the details there. And then with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.